This is the first in a two-part Blender video series that demonstrates how to make this vintage microphone. In this first video, we'll be making the main body of the microphone, and we'll be using a new add-on called Mesh Tissue, which will help us to make the honeycomb hole pattern in the microphone screen. In the second video, we'll be making the microphone stand and the microphone cable. Then we'll set up the materials using the new principled shader. The overall look of this microphone was inspired by some vintage microphones, but I've changed some of the details in hopes of giving it some unique qualities. During the video, I'll be using some new features that were added to Blender in version 2.79, so make sure that you have that version or newer before starting the project. I'll be using Blender version 2.79. Let's start by creating a new project, and then we'll enable the Mesh Tissue add-on. So from the File menu, select New, and then click on Reload Startup File. Then from the File menu, select User Preferences, and click the Add-ons tab. Make sure that the categories is set to All, and then type Tissue in the search box. Now add a check mark next to Mesh Tissue to enable this add-on. To make it easier to see the scale and location of the objects that we'll be adding, switch from Perspective to Orthographic View by pressing 5 on the number pad. Now delete the cube by right-clicking on it to make sure that it's selected, and then press X. To help align the objects that we'll be adding, I'm going to center the 3D cursor before adding objects so that the objects will be added at the same location. So press Shift S and select Cursor to Center. To make the microphone screen, we're going to start with an icosphere object. So press Shift A and add a mesh icosphere. Set the number of subdivisions to 4. Make sure that you change the subdivisions right after adding the icosphere because you won't be able to change it later. Now press Tab for edit mode. We're going to delete the bottom half of this sphere. So press 1 on the number pad for front view. Then switch to wireframe mode so that we can select vertices on the front and the back at the same time. Now press A once or twice until nothing is selected. Then press B for border select and select all of the vertices on the bottom half of the sphere. Don't include the center vertices in the selection. Then press X to delete and select vertices. Next, we're going to extrude the bottom of the object down on the Z-axis. So press B and select the bottom vertices. Then extrude on the Z-axis by pressing E, then Z, then -3, then Enter. Now switch back to solid view mode. We're going to be using a duplicate of this shape later on, so let's make a copy of it. So press Tab for object mode. To duplicate it without moving it, press Shift D and then right-click. Now go to the outliner and name this object Filter. Then press H to hide it until later. Now right-click the original object to select it. Name this object Screen. Then press Tab for edit mode. Now we're going to add 20 edge loops. So press Ctrl R and hover the mouse over one of these edges until you see the ring that surrounds the cylinder. Now don't click any mouse buttons, but instead type the number 20 and then press the Enter key twice. Next, at the bottom of the Tools panel, open the section named Tissue Tools. These tools were added when we enabled the Mesh Tissue add-on. You'll notice that the icosphere is made up of triangles and the cylinder is made up of rectangles. Next, press A once or twice until everything is selected and then click the Dual Mesh button. Now the sphere is made up of a honeycomb pattern, which is exactly what we want. A little later, we're going to be putting a hole through each of these faces. The cylinder area is also made up of a honeycomb pattern, but the pattern is twisted. So we're going to untwist it. To do that, start by pressing 1 on the number pad for front view. Then switch to wireframe mode so that we can select the vertices on the front and back at the same time. Now press A once or twice until nothing is selected. Then press B for border select and select all of the vertices on the half sphere at the top. Now switch back to solid view. We're going to rotate the selected vertices on the z-axis, and we want the other vertices to move along with them. So enable proportional editing, and then set the fall off to linear. When we rotate this, it doesn't matter if the honeycomb pattern is twisted at the bottom of the cylinder or at the top of the cylinder where it meets the sphere. We'll fix these areas later. Right now we're only concerned with the center portion of the cylinder. Now press R to rotate, and then press Z to restrict the rotation to the z-axis. Now use the scroll wheel and adjust the size of the white circle to be larger than the cylinder. All of the vertices inside the circle will be affected. Now move the mouse to rotate the vertices until the honeycomb pattern on the cylinder shape is no longer twisted. And then click the left mouse button. Next, we'll untwist the area at the top of the cylinder where it meets the sphere. To do that, start by disabling proportional editing. Then rotate on the z-axis by pressing R, then Z, then rotate until it's no longer twisted. And then left click. Next, we're going to delete the bottom edge. So hold down the Alt key and right-click the bottom edge to select all of the vertices around the bottom. Then press X to delete and select Vertices. Now we're going to put holes in all of the faces. The great majority of faces have 6 sides, but there are several faces that only have 5 sides and are a little smaller. We'll start by adding holes to the faces with 6 sides and then separately add holes to the faces with 5 sides. If we don't do these separately, then the holes in the 5-sided faces will look smaller than the others. So switch to Face Select mode so that we can select only faces. Then right-click one of the 6-sided faces to select it. Then from the Select menu, go to Select Similar and select Polygon Sides. This will select all of the 6-sided faces. With these faces selected, it makes it easy to see the 5-sided faces on the top that are not selected. Next, we're going to inset the faces. If we do this by pressing the I key once, then all of the faces will be inset as a single group. However, if we press the I key twice, then all of the faces will be inset individually, which is what we want. So press I twice, then type 0.02, then press Enter. Now press X to delete and select Faces. Now right-click one of the 5-sided faces to select it. Then from the Select menu, go to Select Similar and select Polygon Sides. Then press I twice and type 0.005, then press Enter. Now press X to delete and select Faces. Next, we're going to add some thickness to it and smooth it out. So press Tab for Object Mode. Then select the Object Modifier panel if it's not already selected, and add a Solidify modifier. Set the thickness to 0.02. Then set the offset to 1 so that the thickness will be applied in the outward direction. We want the thickness to be applied outwards because the copy that we made earlier is going to go inside of it. Now smooth it out by adding a subdivision surface modifier. Set the View and Render values to 2, and then click the Smooth button. Next, we're going to unhide the filter object that we duplicated earlier and then smooth it out. So press Alt-H to unhide it. Then right-click it at the bottom to select it. Then click the Smooth button. Now is a good time to save what I have so far. I'm going to name it mic.blend. Now we're going to add the piece that goes over the top and sides of the microphone. To prevent the current objects from getting in our way, find the filter and screen objects in the outliner and click the buttons that look like eyes to hide the objects. Next, make sure the cursor is centered by pressing Shift-S and then select Cursor to Center. Now press Shift-A and add a mesh circle. Then rotate it on the x-axis by pressing R, then X, then 90, then Enter. Then scale it up in size by pressing S, then 1.06, then Enter. Now press Tab to switch to edit mode, and then press 1 on the number pad for front view. Next, we're going to delete the bottom half of the circle, so click the Vertex Select button. Then press A once or twice until nothing is selected. Then press B for Border Select and select all of the vertices below the center, but not the center vertices. Then press X to delete and select Vertices. Next, we'll select the bottom vertices and then extrude them down on the Z-axis. So press B and select the bottom vertices. Then extrude by pressing E, then Z, then -3, then Enter. Now we're going to give it some width, so press A twice to select everything. Then extrude on the Y-axis by pressing E, then Y, then 0.5, then Enter. Next, we're going to give it some thickness. I'll zoom in for this step so that we can see it better. Now add a solidify modifier. Set the thickness to 0.02. Next, we're going to smooth it out, so add a subdivision surface modifier. And set the view and render values to 2. You'll notice that when we add this modifier, the bottom edges are no longer sharp. To fix this, we'll add more geometry at the bottom. So add an edge loop by pressing ctrl R, then position the mouse over this edge and left click. Then drag it near the bottom and left click again. Now repeat this on the other side. So press ctrl R, put the edge loop here and left click. Then drag it down and left click again. To make this piece look more realistic, we're going to add some slight bends to the straight areas. To do that, we're going to add 4 evenly spaced loop cuts on each side. So press ctrl R, position the mouse over this edge and use the scroll wheel to make 4 loop cuts. Then left click and then right click. Now repeat this on the other side. So press ctrl R, position the mouse over this edge and use the scroll wheel to make 4 loop cuts. Then left click and then right click. Now press Tab to switch to object mode. Before making the bends in this object, we need to position it. To do that, we need to see the microphone screen. So find the filter and screen in the outliner and click the buttons that look like eyes to unhide these objects. Now press 3 on the number pad for right side view and then move the object to the center. Then press 1 on the number pad for front view. I'll zoom in for this next step. Now drag the object down until it just touches the top of the screen. Now we're ready to add the bends to the object. Later we're going to be adding screws to this object at the location of the bends. The bends will make it look like the screws are pressing the object up next to the screen. To add the bends, press Tab for edit mode. Then click the Edge Select button. Now right-click this edge to select it. Then press 1 on the number pad for front view. Then drag it until it just touches the screen. Now we'll do the other side, so right-click this edge to select it. Then press 1 on the number pad for front view and drag it until it just touches the screen. Now we'll add bends near the bottom, so press A to deselect everything. Then press B and select these bottom edges. Then press 1 on the number pad for front view and drag it until it just touches the screen. Now we'll do the other side, so press A to deselect everything. Then press B and select these bottom edges. Then press 1 on the number pad for front view and drag it until it just touches the screen. Next, we'll sharpen the front and back edges. So press ctrl R, put the loop cut here and left click. Then drag it near the back and left click again. Then press ctrl R again, put the edge loop here and left click. Drag it near the front and left click again. Now let's add the screws. For this step, we're going to use the Bolt Factory add-on. So from the File menu, select User Preferences. Make sure the Add-ons tab is selected and all categories are selected. Then in the entry box, type Bolt. Then add a check mark next to Bolt Factory. You can close the Preferences window now. To prevent the current objects from getting in our way, find the filter and screen objects in the outliner and click the buttons that look like eyes to hide them. We're going to be adding the screws to this object, but we don't want the solidify modifier to be applied to the screws. So let's apply the modifier before adding the screws. To do that, press Tab for Object Mode. Then click the Solidify Modifier's Apply button. Now press Tab to return to Edit mode. Next, make sure the cursor is centered by pressing Shift-S and select Cursor to Center. Now press A once or twice until nothing is selected. To use the Bolt Factory add-on to make a screw, press Shift-A and select Bolt. Then on the left, change the bit type to Phillips and change the head to pan. Make sure that you change the bit type and head values right after adding the bolt because you won't be able to change them later. Next, rotate it on the Y-axis by pressing R, then Y, then 90, then Enter. Then scale it down in size by pressing S, then 0.3, then Enter. Now we'll move it into position. So start by moving it to the right. Then press 3 on the number pad for right side view. Then drag it down until it's centered over this edge. This edge is where the bend is at. Now press 1 on the number pad for front view and drag it over until it's next to the bend. Next, we'll duplicate it and put it on the other side. So press Shift-D, then X, then drag it to the other side and left-click. Then rotate it on the Y-axis by pressing R, then Y, then 180, then Enter. Now drag it over until it's next to the bend. Now press Tab for Object Mode and then press the Smooth button to smooth it out. Next, we're going to make the blue ring that goes around the microphone. So press Shift-S and select Cursor to Center. Then press Shift-A and add a mesh circle. Then scale it up in size by pressing S, then 1.06, then Enter. Now press Tab for Edit mode. Then click the Vertex Select button. And then press A once or twice until the whole circle is selected. Then extrude and scale by pressing E, then S, then 1.07, then Enter. Now press A twice to select all. Then extrude by pressing E, then 0.02, then Enter. I'm extruding by a small amount to add extra geometry near the edges. This will keep the edges sharp after we add a subdivision surface modifier later on. Now extrude again by pressing E, then 1, then Enter. Then extrude to add more geometry to the top by pressing E, then 0.02, then Enter. Next, we'll smooth it out, so add a subdivision surface modifier. Set the view and render values to 3. Next, we'll make a cutout in the ring where the button will be. So add 2 evenly spaced edge loops by pressing Ctrl R, then position the mouse over one of these edges and use the scroll wheel to make 2 loop cuts. Then left-click and then right-click. Now press 1 on the number pad for front view and then click the Face Select button so that we can select only faces. Then press A once or twice to deselect everything. Next, press B for Border Select and select the 4 faces in the center. Now we're going to extrude these faces into the ring. So press E, then -0.05, then Enter. Then to sharpen the edges, we'll inset the faces. So press I, then 0.01, then Enter. Next, we're going to duplicate these faces to make the button. This will give us 2 separate meshes, one for the ring and one for the button. This will make it easier to add separate materials to them later. To duplicate the faces without moving them, press Shift-D and then right-click. These new faces are the back of the button. To add thickness to it, extrude by pressing E, then 0.1, then Enter. We're going to sharpen the back edges by adding a loop cut. So press Ctrl-R, put the edge loop here and left-click. Then drag it all the way to the back and left-click again. Next, press Tab for Object Mode and then click the Smooth button. Now find the filter and screen in the outliner and click the buttons that look like eyes to unhide these objects. Next, we're going to move the ring into position. So drag it down until it covers the bottom row of holes in the screen. Now we'll make the bottom of the microphone. To do this, we're going to duplicate and modify the filter object that we made earlier. So find the filter in the outliner and select it. Now duplicate it and move it on the Z-axis by pressing Shift-D, then Z, then drag it down and left-click. Name this object Bottom. Now rotate it on the X-axis by pressing R, then X, then 180, then Enter. Then move it down. Now press Tab for Edit Mode. Then click the Edge Select button if it's not already selected. Next, we're going to shorten it. So press A once or twice until nothing is selected. Then hold down the Alt key and right-click the top edge to select the entire top edge. Then move it on the Z-axis by pressing G, then Z, then -2.4, then Enter. Now smooth it out by adding a subdivision surface modifier. Set the view and render values to 2. Next, we're going to round the top edge by adding some additional geometry. So extrude and scale by pressing E, then S, then 0.9, then Enter. Then add a loop cut by pressing Ctrl-R, put the loop cut here and left-click. Then drag it near the top and left-click again. Now press Tab for Object Mode and then click the Smooth button. Next, we'll scale it up in size, so press S, then 1.12, then Enter. Now we'll move it into position, so press 1 on the number pad for front view. Then drag it up until it just touches the rest of the microphone. I'm going to save what I have so far. Well, that concludes this video. In the next video, I'll demonstrate how to make the microphone stand and the microphone cable. Then we'll set up the materials using the new principled shader. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe and leave a comment.